Welcome to The Main Perspective, Episode 2 of the podcast series on trust across race and culture, discussion of Black and White. I'm your host, Regina Wharton. Tune in to Episode 1 to hear how the Women's Intercultural Exchange, WIE, laid the foundation to build trust across race and culture. Let me introduce our speakers. Barbara Ellis, retired corporate vice president, community advocate, and chair, WIE Advisory Council. Nicole Washington Dean, principal consultant and coach, Xavier Austin Group, LLC, former HR and diversity and inclusion executive. Joan Zimmerman, founder and CEO, Southern Shows, community advocate, former WIE board chair. Here are the trending headlines. Black America faces dual public health crisis, coronavirus and racism. Corporate America has failed Black America, New York Times. Meet the only 4 Black Fortune 500 CEOs, and none are women. So in the midst of a pandemic and protesting for racial equality and social justice, no peace, let's start a dialogue. What's your reactions to the headlines? Barbara, let's start with you.
Well, thanks, Regina. Thanks for having me. Actually, I see this as on the pandemic more of a 3-pronged pandemic. A health pandemic, an economic pandemic, and a pandemic of racism. And they're all so intertwined. The health pandemic has affected the Black and Brown communities significantly, who are in service jobs that don't give them the opportunity to earn a working wage, which feeds into the health pandemic of the issues that you see in the Black community with continuing health issues. And then all of that kind of bubbles up into the whole discussion around racism and how we've addressed these communities in the past. So this, to me, is the coming together of 3 pandemics that really demonstrate the issues that we need to address and how we need to, with a laser focus on these underserved communities in a much more significant way.
So 3 pandemics. Appreciate you calling that out. Nicole, your reactions?
Yes, thank you, Regina, and all the ladies. I feel privileged to be on this conversation and just appreciate the time to learn and listen and hear from all of you as well. Like Barb said, I think the commonality of the pandemics are showing us great disparities, just like the other headlines highlighted. And when I think about headlines, their purpose is to get our attention. And they also act as a teaser or a first point of a call for change. But what I want to speak to is how what we've all experienced during these 3 pandemics right now, that they are affecting us collectively in our community. And that is the experience of not feeling safe. Everyone can relate to that. The feelings of grief and fear tied to COVID-19 was felt across all races and social and economic statuses. And then when you talk about the longstanding feelings that turn into depression and anxiety, there's many headlines talking about that for people. And then the fact that that has physical, emotional, and spiritual health ramifications. Those are all experienced by everyone, but yet what has been shined, the light has shone really brightly on the disparities. And so the opportunity for us to get beyond the headlines and to have dialogue about what's really going on as the opportunity is what is top of mind for me.
And certainly there's a lot of dialogue that's happening based on all of these headlines, but certainly what's happening. Joan, chime in with your reactions.
Well, my reaction to the headlines that you read were, it's hard to believe we're still seeing those headlines in 2020. I mean, they are all issues that affect so many lives. And more importantly, what we all need to realize is those headlines and what's behind those headlines affect the future of America. So, having said that, I'll go to the issues that we're dealing with very promptly right now, and that is the pandemic. And it has affected lives economically. It's affected the health, as several people, in both Nicole and Barb said. It's made this a fearful nation. We're all in our fear warehouses wondering what to do next. But it does occur to me that the problems or the issues, including this very real health one, goes right back to the issues that are age old. And those are making a living wage, the dignity and pay that we allocate to all work. It goes back to education, and it goes back to every person receiving full rights of citizenship. So I was not surprised to hear that this pandemic was affecting Black and brown people at a higher rate, because so many are in the essential positions, emphasis on essential, that keep our communities alive. And a lot of those positions, sadly and unbelievably, do not offer a living wage. So the pandemic, as well as the protests, they've drawn a spotlight back on issues that have existed for a long time. And we can either hope that things will get better, or we can push to get these problems at or at least near the top of the long list of problems that we have to solve.
Thank you. Within each one of your comments. So let's hear who you are, more about who you are. So Barbara, share your story of how you became a prominent Black woman executive with a major corporation and how you became connected to WIE.
Well, my story begins in the 70s. Just as some context for my comments, I was hired out of college. I got my degree in business education. And at the time, many companies were implementing their affirmative action programs, which was the enforcement part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I was fortunate to be hired by the IBM Corporation in the service division in the branch office in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, this division was male dominated. Many of the service technicians had come from the military, and then here I am with a college degree and coming into this male dominated culture. It wasn't always a welcoming environment because people had very different views of affirmative action. And so it was really the beginning of my journey to being motivated to really prove that I belonged. And my journey in that division was one of constant preparation and making sure that I took the right assignments and proved myself in every job, which in many cases, I had to do more jobs than my counterparts. But I persevered and I moved up through the ranks within that division and then moved on to the sales division where I ultimately became an executive. Thanks to the opportunities provided by many of the managers that I worked for, who, by the way, were all white because there were no African American executives, or very, very few could be found. And so I was able to progress based on being given the opportunities to take high risk, very visible assignments and continue to prove my value to the business unit to the point that I was promoted to an executive position and was able then to break through some barriers that allowed others to come behind me. So I had a great career, and I also worked for a company that adopted equal opportunity is one of its core values, having adopted its own equal opportunity policy in 1953, well before the Civil Rights Act. So that was one of the part of the corporate culture, just making our way through that as my career progressed was challenging at times, but in the end, it was very rewarding. And my connection to WIE, one of the fun things I did while working at IBM was to be the co-chair of the U.S. Women's Task Force. And this was around 1995 when IBM launched its task forces and declared diversity as a business imperative. And within that women's task force, there were two subcommittees, one on multicultural women and the other on women in technology. So I was able to lead the conversation and initiatives around multicultural women, which many of the recommendations we made were adopted. When I retired and moved back here to Charlotte, I was looking for a way to continue engaging with multicultural women. And I met Linda Lockman Brooks at a multicultural women's conference, and she invited me to join the WIE advisory board. It has been a wonderful experience to engage with WIE, building trust across race and culture. I have met so many wonderful women and served in a number of roles in the organization. I think it's one of the most important organizations in our community around building trust. So I'm delighted to be associated with the organization and hope it continues for a very long time because I plan to be there.
Thank you, Barb. It's been an honor to serve with you on the advisory council for WIE. Nicole, share your success story as a Black woman with senior executive roles and currently consulting. What's your connection to WIE?
So I'll start with my career began in public accounting during a time where firms or public accounting firms recognized that the future of accounting roles would be best served by recruiting both women and more minorities. So I started with Deloitte & Touche and became a CPA, and very soon learned that I was not interested in doing taxes or monthly book closings, but my personal interest was really more around process improvement, how businesses manage risk, and leading teams. As a junior leader or a supervisor, I was given the feedback that I built trust and relationships with my team members because I gave them the real feedback that they needed to develop. And I think that's just really part of how I approach my work, always wanting to be better and performing at a higher level than what was expected of me. So with that, I had the fortune of being promoted early throughout my career, and in 2006 was hired into a vice president role here at Belk Department Stores, leading internal audit, again, focused on process improvement and business controls. And with that same desire to still, focus on people, because that's where compliance, risk, and change management really rests. I pivoted into an HR role after becoming quite involved in our diversity efforts. So I'm going to step back really quickly and share that, similar to Barb's experience being the only one or very few at the executive level, I was actually the first Black or Brown woman executive at Belk when I was hired, and got the opportunity to work closely with my CEO to talk about the change that was necessary from both a culture and a policy and procedure standpoint, so that we could become more diverse and inclusive in the workplace. And through that work, we partnered and sponsored many things in Charlotte. Our CEO actually made diversity and inclusion a core tenet as chair of the Charlotte Chamber, which is now the Charlotte Regional Partnership. And as part of that, we sponsor WIE events. So I got to attend town halls and the one-day conferences and was just blown away at WIE's ability to, one, get the interest and attention of so many women within the corporate space to come together and share insights, share learnings, but most importantly, to build trust. So these days, I have come to personally be involved with WIE through cross-cultural conversations and leading them last year for a group of women who were multi-ethnic as well as multi-generational. That was important to me personally, but it also dovetails in my work. So I said to you, I pivoted out of process improvement and focusing on people. And as part of my journey, I got to experience executive coaching while I was at Belk so that I can improve my impact and influence and realize this is the work that I need to be doing. And so I made another pivot into change management, which is all about leading change in organizations, doing that by creating awareness, all the way through to leading the reinforcement of behaviors. And so being responsible for strategic change initiatives at Belk, I've been able to incorporate what I learned through corporate experience in my practice of walking alongside individual leaders as well as executive teams to integrate change around people and what really matters into their strategic priorities and conveying that so that their organization can actually accomplish the change and make it stick.
And you're doing outstanding work. So thank you. Thank you for that. Joan, share your story of being a prominent white woman business owner. What attracted you to WIE, especially cross-cultural conversations?
Well, first, let me say I was really interested in hearing Barbara talk about affirmative action and Nicole talk about being the first Black woman in many, many rooms. And of course, at my age, and going back as long as I do, I was the first woman in a lot of rooms. And what I discovered was, if you have a sense of humor and you can be still determined, you can stay in the room and make a difference. And that's what Barbara, Nicole, and a lot of we women have done. So, so far as my story, I'll spare you the early years as did Nicole and Barbara, because they are long. And I'll start with when I came to the United States in 1951. I was 19. I was alone. I knew no one. I had about $47 in a room booked at the YMCA in downtown Chicago. Now, luckily, I got a job the day after I arrived in Chicago. After a lot of different jobs, and they were different in Germany and Chicago, I finally ended up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I landed in Greensboro because in Germany I had met this amazing man named Robert Zimmerman, and that was his hometown. I will digress a little bit and tell you that when I arrived in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1955, it was a culture shock, such as I had never experienced. There were still 2 water fountains. There was still back of the bus seating. There were so many things that I was horrified. And I decided right there and then that in my own little determined mind, something must be done. And right then in 1955 is when my affiliation or my need to be associated with change began. So we go on to Southern Shows, which I launched there in 1959. I was 27. I had a 1-year-old son, and I was working in a PR firm. Now, when the opportunity to start the company came about, the banks would not lend me any money because I was a woman, and women needed their husbands or some significant male signature in order to get money. Well, I had no money, I had no equity, and neither did Robert, and the type of company I was planning did not exist in this part of the country. So in other words, you are a banker, Regina. I was a very bad risk, and I was. But fast forward, we did succeed with the advice of a lot of people, no financial help, but a lot of good advice and hard work. So thank you to everyone who brought us to where we are. But the story is about WIE and how I became connected and what it's meant to me. My reason for joining was probably the same as a lot of people's, and her name is Stephanie Counts, who's the co-founder of WIE. Stephanie believed and still believes that if we can bring women of all cultures and all ages and all economic backgrounds together, that we can create an atmosphere of trust, which she convinced me was sadly lacking and absolutely necessary if we were going to get anything done in the area of social and racial justice. Well, she's very convincing, so of course I listened. Well, the fact that I got to say though, I really did not think that the problems were as deep as Stephanie was telling me they were. Because in my uneducated at that time mind, there were very few problems, and certainly they surely had to be insignificant. Well, the fact that I'm part of WIE today will tell you I was wrong, and really, really wrong. There was so much I did not know, and probably still do not know, about other races and cultures. My first town hall was eye-opening. I was scared to death. My first cultural chat was mind-changing. And to be close one-on-one and hearing the stories from such amazing women, it totally changed my attitude, and it probably, hopefully for the better, changed my life. Because in those meetings, when you hear women of other cultures say, I don't want to be part of the big melting pot. I want to be me. I want to have my own cultures and my own heritage, and I want to have a future. And I thought, well, who would not want to be part of the American melting pot? I mean, after all, I'd given up my British citizenship to be a part of it. But then when you really listen and you get into more and more conversations and listen deeply to what's being said, you realize that what's being said is going to be better, it's going to be different, it's going to be good, and that being equal does not mean being identical. and there's room for lots of colors and creeds and opinions around every table. So it may only look like a blip on the big screen, but WIE has resulted in thousands of multicultural friendships that would never have happened. And it has resulted in people like me being more intentional about what I do and being aware of who has a seat at the table and really listening to the backstory. One story I like to tell is a big fundraiser, a great, wonderful ball that was held at Quail Hollow Country Club. And I was very intentional of who I invited to be at my table. We were the only out of 600 people, we were the only multicultural table group at that event. Now, what's interesting is that afterwards, the one who created the event, the organizer, came up to me and said, "Joan, I am so embarrassed. I am so embarrassed. This will never happen again." And it didn't. And also what's interesting, especially in view of what's happening right now, is that when Stephanie and I first began to call on corporations and individuals 15 years ago, asking for funding to grow this organization, I would say 8 out of 10 of those we spoke with said they really didn't see a need for what we were proposing, that everything in Charlotte was just fine. And those companies who did see the need, they're still involved, and we're still fighting the same problem.
I find your stories to all be so compelling as I was listening to each one of you. And I'm reminded of, which we didn't talk about earlier, but we're at an all-time high of 37 women CEOs of Fortune 500s. And I don't know what it would take for us to get to 100, let's say. That would be a great journey to hear about. But what I do know is we will get there. And hearing stories from women like you will really help us to do that. So let's move on a little bit around this pandemic. Let's talk more about that. The pandemic has played a role with uncovering deeply rooted structural racism. Many believed we were making progress. However, the pandemic shines a harsh light on racial disparities, as well as cultural and class divides within America. Can you all talk a little about how that impacts you? Nicole, maybe you go first. Or actually, let's hear from Barb first.
That's really a great question you pose there. So what's the old saying, when America sneezes, the world gets a cold? Well, let's change that up a little bit to say that when America sneezes, the Black and brown communities get the flu. And nothing is more evident than with this pandemic, as it has impacted the Black and brown communities much more significantly, because, as Joan said earlier, these are the communities of the essential workers. They work in grocery stores and retail and childcare, and they deal with issues related to the factors related to disparities, which are really no surprise. I see them in my own family. My family, we grew up on West Boulevard, and we deal with issues of diabetes and high blood pressure and so forth. And it was a long time before my family actually was able to achieve enough income to purchase health insurance. But you find in many of these communities, that they don't have adequate health insurance or access to health care. They lack access to nutritious foods. I mean, those communities do not meet the demographic of many of the grocery stores for their target markets. And they deal with chronic health issues that sometimes are hereditary, but based on diet and lifestyle. And so you can see in the assessment, I recently read the 2018 assessment from the state for the State of the County Health Report, which raises all of these issues and the neighborhoods where these issues continue to exist. So there's a lot more work to be done in terms of addressing these issues.
Joan, how about you?
On the COVID pandemic, but I think what we also need to talk about is the racial pandemic and what is happening in that area and what conversations we're having with our children. And my children happen to be 62 and 59, so my conversations are a lot different and probably a lot easier than yours would be. Fortunately, my children and grandchildren and I share the same mindset on what justice should mean and what it should look like and doesn't. I talked to my son, Robert, in Asheville. He's quite involved there, and I wanted to share with him what I had just read so he could include it in his Asheville discussions. And it was written by a woman, I believe she's a friend of Nicole's, and you probably all know her, is Adrienne Threet. She's the founder and executive director of Hope Vibes here in Charlotte. And her message carries both a challenge and, true to her calling, it offers hope. So here's what she said. The protests of themselves are not the end goal. These protests are the nationwide fire alarms going out to signal to others there's a house on fire in the neighborhood. That house may need the attention of surrounding neighbors until the firemen arrive. My hope, said Adrienne, is that other citizens who are not in that burning house step out of their positions of complacency and do what is in their ability to help put out the fires of racism, injustice, and inequality. She said she hopes that years from now, we'll be able to look back and say together, we went and we overcame together. And so do I, Adrienne, so do I. I have learned from WIE conversations that the trust goes back to the pandemics, it goes back to the health issues, it goes back to education, it goes back to so many things, and that is what WIE is all about. Nicole said earlier in conversations that 3 people can hear the same story, and we all hear it differently, depending on our perspective and culture. But certainly, we all agree, I hope, that more can be accomplished by listening and by really, really hearing the many, many voices. My family and I discussed the fact that saying and doing nothing and just hoping things will change is another form of apathy, which we absolutely cannot any longer afford. So it took me a long time to figure out, and I'm not sure I figured it out yet. My kids certainly don't think I have. But I hope I learned that I just had to show up and listen and then act on my conscience. James Baldwin said it best. He said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. We do need change. And I hope we can come together and stay together, Adrienne, long enough to face them and make some lasting changes.
Nicole?
So I think what Barb and Joan spoke to is really this notion that there has been an erosion or a breach of trust that many in our society have felt, experienced, that now there's this awakening that other people are starting to acknowledge and understand. A recent survey says 76% of Americans believe that we have an issue with racial discrimination. And that was recently done after hearing of all the different headlines and paying attention to what we're seeing unfold in our country. And so, with that being the opportunity for us to build trust or rebuild trust or create trust where trust did not exist, the reality is we believe what we know from our own experiences. And we trust what we believe. And that could be our own experiences or what we've affirmed through continually seeking more of what we believe. And so what I love about WIE and the cross-cultural conversations is that WIE has created a platform for us to find a safe space to have dialogue that challenges what we believe or what was instilled in us to believe, even at a formative age, by providing us new opportunities to experience what other people are going through. And so, quite simply put, it's really moving us from apathy and or complicit, being complicit, to a place of empathy. And so one of the things I've taken away from having led cross-cultural conversations with WIE is to do that since the incidents with George Floyd occurred. So we can use our own influence, which is what I believe is the goal of WIE, to use our own influence after we come away from those conversations to make change based on our own gifts, our own spheres of influence, individually and collectively. And I appreciate that opportunity.
I don't think we can leave today's conversation, as I think deeply about this pandemic, without naming some of the individuals who have been impacted. So George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, most recently, Rayshard Brooks, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin. Saying their names is really critical. And I heard Joan and I heard within Barb's comments, our children and conversations that we're having with our children, whether they're 5, whether they're 15, 25, 35, Jones are 60s. These conversations are really, really important. And I know that they're also difficult to have. I'm having them every day with my kids. And their main thing that they're asking me is, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this structural racism that exists? What is going to happen next? And so it will take all of us. It really will. And I believe that, and that's the hope that I have. It will take all of us to work together to get there. So what's the call of action for WIE? What will we do? Barb, what do you think? What's the call of action for WIE?
So, Regina, I think that just the mere fact that the Women's Intercultural Exchange fosters trust across race and culture and promotes dialogue where we can understand each other's stories and the issues that we all face from our own perspectives and our histories is such an important component of understanding where we are and where we need to go. We all pay the price for indifference in our communities. And I've always contended, and I learned this in my IBM work with the Women's Task Force. I've always contended that when women mobilize in a community around issues, things get done. because we are unwavering. We are an unwavering force for change. We're the culture bearers of our families and our communities. So we have a unique opportunity through the dialogue and the consensus on what issues our communities face to be able to move forward and have a voice within the community to promote change. And so I think that's why I think what we do in WIE is so very important.
Joan, what's the call of action?
Well, I was really fascinated to hear Nicole refer to WIE as a safe space. I love that. But I think anyone considering WIE should also realize that it is also an uncomfortable space, and intentionally so. But it's not judgmental. It's an amazing atmosphere in which to learn. So the call to action, my call to action, would be, first of all, join WIE or create your own little community neighborhood WIE, but make it multicultural. And second, participate, get involved, find out what's wrong and try to make it better. Not quite right, because after 50 years, we're still not there, or 400 years. So join, participate, listen, and figure out how you as an individual can help make a difference. That would be my call to action. And after being outside Woolworth 60 years ago, it's pretty obvious I do not have the answer to that question, but I do believe that most change that lasts starts in small personal groups like WIE. Just showing up, listening, asking questions, and the hard one, not being judgmental. I am not naturally a patient person, but I have come to agree with what I think is an old Indian proverb, and it says, 50 miles in, 50 miles out. On this route, there are no shortcuts.
Nicole?
One of the things I personally appreciate about WIE is the focus and emphasis on research, as well as creating these environments for the dialogue and the relationship building to happen. I remember coming in to lead the cross-cultural chats, and we were put through an excellent training program that was built upon research and studied authors like Peter Rock, who wrote Community. And so I think the call to action for WIE is as the work continues, to continue to equip people to have these dialogues within their own spheres of influence, so that it multiplies exponentially so. And so that would be the call to action, because participation is the first step, and then going and actually participating in the dialogue is the first step. And then the second is use what you have, your own tools, strengths, personality, sphere of influence, and get the word out and engage other people.
Excellent calls to action, outstanding, and all doable. Have courage is what I would add to certainly engage in the recommendations that we've heard from our speakers. Thank you. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you, Joan, Barbara, and Nicole, for sharing with us today. Please join us next week to continue our discussion on trust across race and culture for the conversation with women of Asian descent, sponsored by The Main Event in partnership with WIE. Friday is Juneteenth. Let's be united in celebrating the end of slavery, a monumental event in U.S. history. As we think about the tremendous significance of this day, it brings hope for the journey ahead. Black Lives Matter.